Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was one of those overcast afternoons, the kind that makes everything feel heavier, like the sky is pressing down on the world. I was walking home from work, my mind a haze of exhaustion and thoughts of the evening ahead. The streets were quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of the city muted by the thick, gray clouds that hung above. I didn't mind the quiet, it was peaceful, soothing even. As I walked, I passed the usual shops, the familiar buildings that I had seen 1,000 times before. The street was nearly empty, save for a few pedestrians scattered here and there, each of us lost in our own little world. I didn't really expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. And then, I saw her. She was standing on the opposite side of the street, just across from me, leaning against a lamppost. She was a woman, probably in her late 20s, dressed in a dark coat with a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another passerby, another face in the crowd. But then she smiled at me. It wasn't a broad smile, nothing too obvious, but it was warm, friendly, almost inviting. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what had drawn my attention to her. I wasn't even sure why I noticed her in the first place, considering how many people I walked by every day. But there she was, standing still, smiling gently, her eyes fixed on me from across the street. I gave her a small nod, just out of courtesy. Maybe she had noticed the same things I had about the quiet, empty streets, and she was just being friendly. But as I raised my hand to wave, something in my guts shifted. It wasn't the smile that unsettled me, it was her eyes. They were empty. I can't explain it properly, but it was as though her eyes were hollow, like they were looking at me without really seeing me. There was no life behind them, no depth, just an eerie blankness that made my skin prickle. It wasn't a stare, not exactly. It was more like she was looking through me, like I was a ghost, something invisible to her, yet she still smiled. I couldn't look away. My feet felt frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that I had simply misread the expression, but the longer I stared at her, the more I felt its sense of wrongness, like she was a reflection of a person, not the person themselves. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, she turned her head. But it wasn't just a casual turn, her entire body followed, as if she was locked in place, as if the movement was preordained. The moment she turned her back to me, I felt a wave of relief flood through me. But then I heard it, a sound, a faint sound, like a whisper, coming from across the street. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable, the sound of something being said, something that wasn't meant for anyone else to hear. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively took a step back, my eyes glued to the spot where she had been standing. But when I looked up, she was gone. The street was empty again, as quiet and still as it had been before. I waited for a few moments, hoping to see her again, to make sense of what had just happened. But there was nothing. No one walking down the street. No sign of her anywhere. It was as if she had vanished entirely. I shook my head, brushing off the unease that had settled into my chest. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe it was the stress of the day, or the quiet of the street, that had made me see things. It wasn't unusual to mistake the expression on someone's face when you were lost in thought, right? I resumed walking, trying to shake off the sensation, but something lingered, something cold and unexplainable. As I walked further down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't until I reached the corner, about to turn onto my street, that I saw it again. A reflection in the shop window. I froze. It wasn't just the usual reflection, my own face in the glass. The reflection of the street behind me. No, this time, there was someone else there, standing just behind me in the reflection. Her, the woman from across the street. She was standing in the exact same spot, her eyes fixed on me. Her smile still there, frozen in place, her face as empty as before. She hadn't moved. She was still smiling, but she wasn't in front of me. She was in the reflection. I turned quickly, but when I looked back, there was no one there. The street was still empty. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn around, to look behind me, to make sure she wasn't actually there. But I couldn't. I didn't want to see her again, not like that. I walked home quickly, my steps hurried, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. The image of her face, her eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, kept repeating in my mind. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, just my imagination, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. And though the memory of her smile was still warm, it was the emptiness in her eyes that stayed with me. I didn't go down that street again for a long time. And when I finally did, I walked faster, keeping my eyes on the ground. I couldn't help but look up at the corner where I had seen her, but the street was empty. It had always been empty. But somehow, I knew she was still there, somewhere, watching. It started as a simple walk, the kind of evening stroll I often took when I needed to clear my mind. The air was crisp, the streets quiet, and the low hum of the city felt distant, almost muffled by the trees and the winding roads of the park. I had been feeling restless lately, as if something wasn't quite right, and I thought a little walk would help settle my thoughts. The park was one of those places where time seemed to slow down. The path curved ahead, lined with old lampposts that cast a soft yellow light onto the cobblestones. I had been down this route hundreds of times before, each turn a familiar marker in my daily routine. But tonight, something felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, like the path had become slightly less familiar, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I pulled out my phone, checking the map, more out of habit than necessity. I'd walked this same route a dozen times, but something about the evening made me feel like I needed confirmation, like I wasn't as sure of my surroundings as I thought. The map on my phone showed the familiar layout, the park paths, the winding roads that led back to my street, the little shortcut through the wooded area that would bring me home in half the time. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The map had shifted. At first, it was subtle, just a slight misalignment, as though the GPS had glitched momentarily. But when I zoomed in, the streets were wrong. The path I was standing on didn't match the one on the screen. It was as if the map had suddenly changed. The layout had shifted. The little shortcuts I knew, the landmarks, they were different. Replaced by streets I didn't recognize, leading to places I couldn't quite place. I froze. I zoomed out, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the entire map had changed. I could still see the shape of the park, but it was distorted. Different pathways, different buildings, streets that shouldn't have existed. The landmarks I knew, the streets I walked every day, were no longer there. Instead, there were new roads leading into places I couldn't find on any map I'd seen before. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, the thought crossed my mind that it was a glitch, that the map app was broken, or maybe the GPS was acting up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a technical issue. The more I looked at it, the more the map seemed to take on a life of its own. I glanced up from my phone, and for a moment, I thought maybe the path had shifted too. The trees on the left side of the trail, the ones I had passed 100 times before, seemed different now. Their trunks were thicker, older. The branches stretched higher than I remembered, casting darker shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the path. But I couldn't have been imagining it. The map was in my hand, showing a route I didn't recognize, and the path ahead felt unfamiliar, even though it was the same one I had walked countless times. My hand trembled as I put the phone back into my pocket. The quiet around me felt heavier now, as if the park itself was holding its breath. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to shake off the unease, trying to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I walked, I couldn't help but feel the tension building. Every turn I made felt wrong. The familiar rustling of the leaves sounded different, more like a whispering, as if the trees were talking among themselves, sharing secrets I wasn't meant to hear. The lampposts I passed were dimmer than usual, their glow flickering in a way that felt unnatural, like they were struggling to stay lit. I kept walking, hoping that I would find some sense of normalcy again, but the path ahead only grew more foreign. The quiet was suffocating now, the sound of my footsteps too loud in the silence. The map in my mind, the one I had trusted all this time, had changed, and now the park, the world, felt like it had been replaced by something else. And then I saw it. At the end of the path, where I had always turned left to head back home, there was a door. It was a simple wooden door, standing alone in the middle of the path, with no walls around it, no frame, just an old weathered door standing upright against the trees. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I had never seen this door before. There was no reason for it to be here. I had walked this same path 100 times, and there had never been anything in the way. The door looked out of place, like something from a different world, like something that didn't belong. My legs felt heavy, like the earth beneath me was trying to hold me back. But despite the overwhelming sense of dread, I stepped closer. As I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, the hinges creaking in the wind. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered over the handle, and some strange force urged me to open it. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a darkened room beyond, a room I couldn't make out through the thick shadows. The air that spilled from the doorway was cold, and it smelled faintly of dust and old wood. I stepped forward, the map still lingering in my mind, still showing paths that didn't exist, leading to places I couldn't recognize. The door loomed in front of me, and before I could think twice, I stepped through. The world shifted instantly. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air around me changed. The light outside faded, the sky darkening as though I had crossed into a different time, a different place. The street I had been walking on was gone, replaced by a small, winding alley I didn't know. The buildings around me were old, their facades cracked and weathered, the kind of architecture you might find in a forgotten town, untouched by time. I turned back, but the door was gone. There was nothing behind me now but the narrow alley that stretched on ahead. The city I had known, the park I had walked through, everything had changed. The map in my mind was still there, but it was empty now, just blank space where the familiar streets once were. I stood there for a moment, trying to breathe, trying to gather myself. But everything around me felt so strange, so distant, like I had stepped into another world entirely. The path I had followed, the map I had trusted, it had all led me here. And as I looked around, trying to find my bearings, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to turn back, there was no going home. The path had changed in my hands, and now there was no way back to where I belonged. It was the strangest thing. I had just finished my usual walk through the park, the late afternoon sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the path. The air had a certain chill to it, the kind that comes just before the evening sets in, and the breeze felt like it was whispering, beckoning me to hurry along. My feet carried me absent-mindedly down the street, the usual route I took to get home. I turned the corner and froze. The street was completely empty. Now, this was nothing new. I had often walked down this block at odd hours, and it was usually quiet, but this was different. There was no one around, not a single soul. No cars, no people, no street vendors, not even the usual hum of city life. Just silence, the kind that pressed against your ears, making everything feel muffled and distant. I looked around, my breath catching slightly in my chest. I could hear the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the faint hum of electricity from the streetlights overhead, but there was no one. Not even the faintest sound of footsteps or voices. Then I heard it. Laughter. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It echoed down the street, bouncing off the walls of the empty buildings. The sound was sharp and high-pitched, like children playing, or maybe even a group of friends sharing a joke. It was the kind of laughter that should have filled the air with energy, but here, in this deserted street, it seemed out of place. It reverberated, hollow, as though it was coming from somewhere far away, or even from within the walls themselves. I glanced up and down the street, trying to locate the source. The laughter persisted, like a memory from the past, faint but lingering, teasing my senses. It seemed to be coming from somewhere close, but there was no one in sight. The street was still, too still. I took a few steps forward, drawn to the sound despite the knot of unease that was tightening in my stomach. The laughter grew louder, more distinct, as if it were closer now. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect in a place like this, a quiet residential street with tall, aging buildings on either side. This was a place for silence, not joy, not laughter. I reached the end of the block and stopped at the corner, looking around once more. Still nothing. No one. And yet, the laughter continued, echoing just beneath the surface of the still air. It wasn't just in my head, I could hear it clearly, and it felt like it was wrapping around me, like it was surrounding me from all sides. The sound shifted then, changing in tone, as though it was moving down the street, closer, yet somehow still out of reach. It wasn't just children anymore. It was voices distinct, male and female, laughing in a way that was both familiar and unsettling. They laughed like they were sharing some private joke, a secret only they knew. A secret that didn't belong in this empty street. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, the wind picking up, rustling through the trees along the sidewalk. I wanted to turn and leave, to run away from the sound, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. The laughter shifted again, this time closer, almost like it was right behind me. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing there, someone who could explain what was happening. But there was no one, nothing, just the empty street, bathed in the fading light of the evening. And then, it happened. The laughter stopped. Just like that. As if a switch had been flipped. The silence that followed was so deep, it was suffocating. It pressed in around me, heavier than before. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to catch my breath. Had I imagined it? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I looked around again, hoping to see a person, a figure, anything, but there was nothing. The street remained empty. I took a hesitant step forward, the feeling of being watched still crawling up my spine. The street seemed the same, but the air felt thick now, as though something had changed. Something had shifted in the space around me. I was about to take another step when I heard it. A soft shuffle from the alleyway. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned toward the sound, but all I could see was the darkness of the alley. The narrow space between two old buildings, empty but for the scattered trash that had blown against the walls. The laughter hadn't returned, but the uneasy sensation of being watched lingered. I felt the sudden need to leave, to get away from this place, to escape whatever it was that I couldn't understand. I turned on my heel, making my way back toward the park, away from the street. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that wasn't quite right. Something that I couldn't put my finger on. The laughter was gone, but I could still hear it in the back of my mind, echoing, faint but constant. And even though the street was empty, I felt like I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, but the echo of that laughter never really left. It was there, in the back of my mind, lingering as I walked away. Something I couldn't explain, but something that stayed with me, like a shadow in the corner of my eye, waiting for me to listen again. And no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one in the street anymore. I'd never been one for signs, at least not in the way that some people were. You know, the type that looks for meaning in every little thing, every bird that crosses their path, every piece of paper they find on the sidewalk. But that evening, as I was leaving work, something about it felt different. It started as I walked through the lobby of the building, an ordinary enough day, ordinary enough exit. But there she was, standing by the door, an older woman, her hair silver and neatly pinned up, wearing a faded, oversized coat that looked out of place in the otherwise sleek, modern office building. She was holding something, a small piece of paper. When I reached the door, she stepped forward, her hand extending toward me, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that stopped me in my tracks. There was something about the way she looked at me, as though she knew something I didn't, something I couldn't yet understand. "Go through that door," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It will take you where you need to go." I blinked, thrown off by the unexpected interaction. Was she talking to me? I glanced around. The hallway behind me was empty, the usual hum of people leaving their offices and heading home fading into the distance. I looked back at the woman, her pale, wrinkled hand still extended, and felt a strange pull toward her. Something about the way she said it, the certainty in her voice, made me hesitate. It felt like I should listen, like the moment had already been set in motion and I had no choice but to follow. Without thinking, I nodded and reached for the door. The moment I touched the handle, a strange sensation washed over me. It was as though the temperature in the room shifted, as if the air itself thickened and hummed with an energy that I couldn't explain. I turned the handle and stepped through into what I thought would be the usual evening street outside. But as soon as the door closed behind me, everything changed. I was no longer standing on the sidewalk outside the office building. I blinked, confused, and looked around. The street stretched before me, but it wasn't the city I knew. It wasn't even close. The buildings on either side were older, more worn. The signs in the windows weren't in English, but in some language I couldn't recognize. The street itself was cobblestone, not the polished pavement I was used to, and the air smelled different, earthier, tinged with a hint of salt, like the sea. I took a step forward, my mind racing. I turned around, half expecting to see the familiar glass and steel of the office building behind me, but there was nothing. The door I had come through was gone, replaced by a solid brick wall, weathered and ancient. I reached out for it, my fingers grazing the rough surface, but the door wasn't there anymore. It was like the building, the hallway, the office sit had all vanished in an instant, leaving me standing on this unfamiliar street in a city I didn't recognize. I stepped further into the street, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The place was quiet, too quiet, considering how busy it had seemed outside the office just moments ago. People walked past me, their faces turned downward, too absorbed in their own lives to notice me. Their clothes were different, older, from a time that felt distant, and they walked with a slow, deliberate pace. Their shoes clicked softly on the cobblestones, and the sound filled the air, oddly comforting in its rhythmic repetition. I walked along the street, looking for any sign, any clue that could help me understand what was happening. The buildings were taller here, looming over me with windows that were cracked and dark. The lights above flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the road. The atmosphere was heavy, like I had stepped into a place that had been forgotten by time, a place where no one remembered the world outside. I kept walking, trying to piece it all together. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. The door had led me here, but where was here? I turned a corner, hoping to find something familiar, something that would tell me I was still in the same city. But when I did, I found myself at the edge of another square, a large plaza with a fountain at its center, the water trickling softly in the quiet. And that's when I saw it. A sign. I crossed the square to get a better look, my heart beating faster. The sign was old, with rusted edges, the letters barely visible, but I could make out one word, painted in faded gold, *Porto, the name of the city. But it wasn't my city. It wasn't even a place I'd ever been before. I looked around again, but there was no sign of how I had gotten here. There was no way back to the world I knew. I was trapped, standing in the middle of a foreign city, without any explanation of how I had arrived or why I was there. I stumbled back, my mind racing, but when I looked over my shoulder, I saw the same old woman from the building. She was standing at the entrance to the square, watching me, her expression unreadable. She hadn't moved, hadn't come closer, but somehow, her presence made it feel like she had been waiting for me all along. I wanted to ask her what was going on, to demand answers, but before I could take a step toward her, she gave me a slight nod, almost as if acknowledging that I had reached my destination. Then, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. The city was still around me, the quiet hum of its life continuing on. And I stood there, in the middle of it all, realizing something that I couldn't shake. This was my destination now. I wasn't going back to the life I knew. This strange, unfamiliar place had taken me in, and I wasn't sure I'd ever find my way out. The door had led me here, and here, it seemed I was meant to stay. I had always been used to the subway. It was part of my daily routine, familiar, predictable. The rhythm of the trains, the clinking of the doors closing, the rush of people getting on and off at each stop. It was nothing more than a quick, mechanical part of my journey, a way to get from one place to the next. But that day, something changed. It started when I stepped onto the platform. It was the same as always, crowded, a bit noisy, the faint smell of dampness in the air. I was tired, the weight of the day settling into my shoulders. I had just finished a long shift, and I was looking forward to the comfort of home. The usual train pulled in, the doors opened with a familiar hiss, and I stepped inside. I found a seat by the window, leaning my head against the cool glass. The subway car was packed, but not unusually so. People were absorbed in their own world's headphones, and eyes glued to their phones, some of them reading or quietly chatting. I closed my eyes, letting the motion of the train lull me into a kind of half-doze, the sound of the wheels on the tracks like a distant lullaby. The train rumbled on, stopping at familiar stations, each one louder and busier than the last. I didn't think anything of it, didn't notice the subtle change in the way the train felt. The usual vibrations were still there, but there was something off about the way the air seemed to shift. The car was quieter now, less bustling, and when I opened my eyes, I realized something was wrong. The signs above the doors, which always displayed the next stop, were now blank. There were no names, no station numbers. I looked around the car, trying to make sense of it. No one else seemed to notice. They were all still absorbed in their own worlds, just as I had been moments ago. I glanced at the door, watching as the usual map of subway lines flickered. But the map was now different. The lines I knew were gone, replaced by a series of unfamiliar paths. The destinations were completely unrecognizable. My stomach tightened. I looked up as the train approached the next station, waiting for the familiar announcement over the speakers. But instead of the usual recorded voice, there was a strange crackle. The voice, when it came, was distorted, as if coming from far away. It was almost unintelligible, but I caught a few words, something about North End End. My heart skipped a beat. The train slowed and came to a stop, the doors opening with a hiss. The platform outside was completely empty, no people, no lights, no sign of life. The walls of the station were cracked, the tiles faded and chipped, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering erratically. It was like stepping into an entirely different world. The station looked abandoned, as though it hadn't seen a single soul in years. I hesitated for a moment. Was this a mistake? Did I miss my stop somehow? I looked around at the empty train car, trying to make sense of it. The few passengers who had been with me remained seated, unfazed. No one seemed to react to the odd stop, the strange station. The train's doors remained open, and I couldn't help the pull to get off. Something in me urged me to step outside, to see what this place was. Maybe I could figure out what had happened. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky from the sudden unease that gripped me. The moment my foot hit the platform, the doors slid shut behind me with a soft hiss. I turned, startled, but the train was already moving again, pulling away from the station. It wasn't until it disappeared into the dark tunnel that I realized something far stranger. There was no train schedule here, no maps, no signs. The station was as empty as the train car, and the air felt thick with a kind of eerie stillness. I glanced around. There were no exits, no stairs leading up to the street, no signs indicating the name of the station or even a way out. I took a few steps forward, but the silence was overwhelming. I could hear my breath, my heartbeat. Everything felt magnified in this strange, dead space. The flickering lights cast long shadows along the walls, and the graffiti that covered some of the old tiles only added to the eerie atmosphere. I started walking toward the far end of the platform, hoping for some sort of answer, but the longer I walked, the more oppressive the place felt. The walls closed in around me, and the air grew colder with each step. The light from the train's windows no longer reached me, leaving me in a thick, suffocating darkness. I stopped. I looked back over my shoulder. I had been walking for what felt like an eternity, but the end of the platform was still just as far away as it had been when I started. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they all seemed to shift and distort around me, like I was walking in a tunnel that had no end, no beginning. I couldn't tell if I was moving at all, or if the station itself was playing tricks on my mind. I tried to turn back and walk toward the station's entrance, but the path I had taken felt wrong now. The walls loomed higher, the shadows deeper. My legs felt like they were moving in slow motion, like the weight of the place was holding me down. There was no exit. There was no sign of the train. I had no idea where I was, or how I had gotten here. The platform, the station, the air, it all felt like a dream. a twisted, empty version of the world I knew. A world that had suddenly swallowed me whole. I stood there, frozen, and listened. The only sound was the soft hum of the lights above, and the soft, distant echo of something I couldn't place. And in that moment, the reality of it all hit me. This place wasn't just unfamiliar, it wasn't real. I tried to call out, to scream for help, but no sound left my lips. The subway station was empty, but somehow it was full of something else, something waiting, something watching. It was late afternoon when I arrived at the bridge. I had been walking for miles, the rhythmic sound of my footsteps on the pavement drowned by the constant rush of the river beneath me. The weather had been unpredictable that day, the sky heavy with clouds, the wind biting as it swept through the air. Despite the chill, I felt oddly calm. There was something about being near the water, about the vastness of the river and the way the world seemed to quiet down when you stood on the edge of it, that always soothed me. The bridge itself was old, its steel beams covered with years of rust, but it had always been sturdy. I had crossed it countless times, each time with the same quiet sense of familiarity. From the middle, you could see the city skyline in the distance. The towering buildings standing against the darkening sky, the soft lights beginning to flicker on as the evening approached. I paused at the center of the bridge, resting my hands on the cool metal railing, staring down at the river below. The water swirled and churned, dark and deep. I always found it mesmerizing the way the current moved, the way the water never stopped flowing. My thoughts drifted, as they often did when I came here. That's when I felt it. At first, it was subtle, a faint tremor beneath my feet. I thought it was just the wind, the kind of gust that makes the ground feel a little unstable. But then it happened again, stronger this time. The entire bridge seemed to vibrate, a low, deep hum reverberating through the metal. It was like the bridge was alive, pulsing with some strange energy. I stepped back, instinctively gripping the railing tighter as the bridge shook once more. This time, the tremor was more pronounced, and I could feel it in my chest. The ground beneath me swaying just enough to make my legs feel unsteady. My heart raced. Something was wrong. I glanced around. There were people walking on the bridge, commuters going about their day, some on bicycles, others with their heads down in thought, walking briskly to wherever they were headed, but none of them seemed to notice. Their movements didn't falter. They kept walking, their pace steady, completely unaware of the bridge trembling beneath them. I took a few steps forward, my pulse quickening, and stood near the center again, feeling the vibrations travel up through my feet. The tremors seemed to last for only a few seconds at a time, but each one was stronger than the last. I could see the water below shifting violently now, the ripples spreading in every direction, though the sky remained unchanged. The bridge was groaning, creaking as if it were straining against something. Something powerful, something that shouldn't be happening. I reached out and touched the metal railing. It was cold, like it always was, but now it felt alive, pulsing in sync with the tremors beneath my feet. Is anyone else feeling this? I whispered to no one in particular, but no one answered. No one even looked up from their phones or stopped walking. They all moved as if the ground wasn't shaking beneath them, as if nothing was out of place. I felt my stomach churn. How could no one else feel this? It was impossible to ignore. The entire structure of the bridge was trembling, as if some great force were pushing against it, and yet, it seemed like I was the only one who could feel it. Was it just me that I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? Another deep rumble shook through the bridge, stronger this time, and I nearly lost my balance. I grabbed onto the railing tighter, my knuckles white with the pressure. The air felt thicker now, and the river below seemed darker, more ominous, as though it were reacting to whatever force was making the bridge tremble. And then, for a moment, everything stopped. The tremors ceased, the hum faded, and the bridge was still again. I stood there, waiting for it to start up again, but the world around me seemed to calm. The sounds of the city returned to my ears, and the people on the bridge continued walking, as though nothing had happened. They moved past me without a second glance, just as oblivious as before. I let out a shaky breath, unsure of what to make of it all. Had it been real? Had it been some kind of localized event, just a glitch in my perception? Or had something far greater been happening, something I couldn't explain? I stayed on the bridge a little longer, watching the river, waiting to see if the tremors would return. But the air had returned to its usual stillness, and the bridge felt solid beneath my feet. The distant hum of the city was calming again. No one seemed to have noticed anything, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just happened, that I had felt something that no one else had. I walked off the bridge, my thoughts swirling. The city seemed the same as it always was, bustling and noisy, people moving in their predictable rhythms. But as I glanced back at the bridge, the faintest tremor ran through the ground beneath me, so slight I almost thought I had imagined it. But when I turned to look at the bridge, it was still as it had always been. Yet, I couldn't forget the feeling of the ground shaking under my feet. The feeling that I had stepped into something no one else had, something no one else could feel. It was a typical Saturday afternoon when I met her, Sarah, sitting alone at the small cafe on the corner. I had been wandering aimlessly, looking for a place to sit and escape the overwhelming noise of the city. When I saw her at the window, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. There was an odd stillness about her, a quiet intensity, and something about her presence caught my attention. I walked inside, ordered a coffee, and took the seat across from her, unsure of why I was drawn to her. She didn't seem surprised that I sat down. In fact, she gave me a small, knowing smile, as if she had been expecting me. "I've been waiting for you," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the soft hum of the cafe. I wasn't sure how to respond. Waiting for me. But we've never met. She nodded slightly, as if that answer was enough. It doesn't matter. You'll understand soon. I had no idea what she meant, but the conversation shifted to simpler things, talking about work, the city, life's mundane details. As we spoke, I couldn't help but feel that there was something strange about her. She wasn't just talking to pass the time, she was speaking as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. Every word felt like it was somehow meant for me, tailored just for this moment. It was when she stood up to leave that things took a turn. "You should go outside," she said, "and walk down the street. Keep walking until you reach the corner. You'll know what to do next. I didn't fully understand what she meant, but there was something about her gaze. The way she looked at MIT felt important, urgent even. I didn't question it. I stood, nodded to her, and walked out of the cafe. The street was bustling with life, the familiar hum of cars and people filling the air, but I felt a strange calm settle over me as I walked. It wasn't like the usual city noise. It was different, quieter. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air felt fresher somehow, less polluted, the world more vivid. I wasn't sure why, but I kept walking, my feet carrying me down the sidewalk as if on their own. I reached the corner of the street and stopped. There was a moment of stillness before the world around me shifted. The buildings that once towered over the street now appeared smaller, older, their windows cracked with age. The cars that had been whizzing past me were replaced by horse-drawn carriages. The sidewalk that had been filled with people in modern clothes now looked different. People wore hats, long coats, and dresses, their movements slower, more deliberate. It was as if I had stepped into another time, another era altogether. I looked around in disbelief, trying to process what was happening. The street I had been walking down, my street was gone. The modern city had vanished, replaced by a version of the past I could hardly recognize. I turned back toward the cafe, hoping it was all some strange trick of my mind, but the building was no longer there. In its place stood a small shop with an old-fashioned sign. The letters faded, the door creaking open as a man in a waistcoat stepped inside. My heart raced. This can't be real, I thought. But everything around me felt so tangible, so alive, the cobblestones beneath my feet, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery down the street, the sound of distant laughter from the people walking by. I walked a few steps, my legs unsteady, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. A woman passed by me, her eyes briefly meeting mine. She was wearing a long dress, her face polite but distant. She didn't seem to notice how strange this all was. She just walked on, blending into the scene like this was completely normal. I tried to speak to her, to ask what was happening, but when I opened my mouth, the words felt out of place. My voice seemed too modern, too sharp for the time I had found myself in. I looked at my phone, hoping to get some reassurance. But it was dead, the screen completely black. The confusion began to settle into something deeper. I had no idea where I was, or when I was. The street around me felt real, but everything was wrong. I didn't belong here. As I continued walking, the weight of it all grew heavier. It was like I had been dropped into a place that wasn't mine, a time that wasn't mine. My breath quickened, and my heart raced as I stumbled through the streets, trying to find a way back, but each turn only led me deeper into the past. The people, the buildings, the way the lights seemed to fall differently, nothing felt familiar anymore. I wandered for what felt like hours, the world around me unchanged, the same as it had been when I first arrived. And then, just as suddenly as it had happened, the street began to change again. The buildings shifted back to their modern forms, the old-fashioned cars replaced by sleek, shiny vehicles. The people on the street wore the clothes I recognized, the world I had known. But something was different. I was different. The weight of the experience, the knowledge that I had just been somewhere else, sat heavily on my shoulders. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the past had followed me back. That something I had seen, something I had felt during those hours, had left a mark on me. I looked around at the familiar buildings, the traffic, the city I thought I knew. And yet, it felt distant, like I had left a part of myself behind in that street, in that past. I didn't turn around to look for Sarah again. I didn't need to. I knew I wouldn't find her. But I couldn't help but wonder, had she known what would happen? Had she meant for me to walk through that door, down that street, into the past? The answers never came, but the feeling stayed with me, and no matter how many times I walked down that street again, I never quite felt like I had fully returned. The past, it seemed, was still waiting for me somewhere, just out of reach. It was the usual kind of day, busy, full of the usual little errands and tasks. The kind of day where the city hums in the background. People rushing from one place to another, each absorbed in their own lives. I was walking through the downtown shopping district. The streets crowded with people, the noise of chatter blending with the faint music drifting from nearby stores. It felt like just another ordinary afternoon. I was on my way to meet a friend, just a few blocks away, and I took the familiar route. The weather was pleasant, cool enough for a light jacket, and the sun was fighting to peek through the clouds. I had my head down, lost in thought, my hands tucked into the pockets of my jacket. The hum of the crowd providing a strange comfort. It was a busy street, one that I'd walked down countless times, but today something felt different. I glanced up briefly and froze. There, a few steps ahead of me, in the middle of the crowd, was someone wearing my jacket. The exact same one I was wearing, the same color, the same worn-in cuffs. I could see the familiar, frayed edge of the sleeves as I watched the person walk. Their movements a little too familiar, too close to mine. For a moment, I thought I had just somehow caught my reflection in a storefront window or mistook someone else for myself. But no, this person wasn't me. They were walking ahead of me, but their posture, the way they carried themselves, was exactly the same. They had my jacket, my shoes, everything about them looked identical to me, from the way they moved to the way they walked. I stopped in my tracks, staring at them for a moment, my heart starting to pound in my chest. This couldn't be right. I had to be imagining it. But as I blinked, the figure ahead of me turned slightly, and I saw their face, my face. The same eyes, the same tired expression, the same slight frown that I often caught myself wearing when I was lost in thought. A chill ran down my spine. It couldn't be possible, but there it was, me, walking ahead of me in the crowd. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was looking at a reflection, but it wasn't. It was a person, standing in front of me, wearing the same clothes, looking as if they were just another random passerby. I instinctively quickened my pace, trying to catch up, to close the distance between us, hoping that when I reached them, I'd see that it was just some odd coincidence, some bizarre mix-up of clothing and posture. But no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't seem to reach them. They stayed just out of arm's reach, walking calmly through the crowd, as though they belonged there. I pushed through the people ahead of me, trying to get closer, my heart racing. I wanted to call out, to say something, but every time I tried to move faster, the figure ahead of me sped up. Just a little faster, always just ahead of me. It was like we were playing some strange game of cat and mouse, but the more I tried to approach, the further they moved. Finally, in frustration, I turned to look at the crowd around me, trying to spot any other details that might make sense of the situation. But everyone was moving, their faces blurred in the chaos. No one seemed to notice the figure ahead of me. No one seemed to see what I was seeing. And then, in an instant, the figure stopped. They turned around slowly, their gaze locking with mine. My stomach dropped. Their face was calm, neutral, but the eyes, they were mine. It was like staring into a mirror that didn't reflect the truth. I couldn't read their expression, couldn't understand what they wanted. The look they gave me was both familiar and unsettling, like seeing an old version of myself standing there, but with something hollow behind their eyes. Before I could speak, or even move, they turned and disappeared into the crowd, vanishing in the sea of people as if they had never been there at all. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath shallow, my chest tight. My hands were clammy, my mind racing. I wasn't sure what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for certain: it hadn't been a trick of the light. It hadn't been a simple coincidence. I had seen myself in the crowd. Myself, but it wasn't me. I walked the rest of the way, trying to calm my racing heart, my thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and disbelief. When I finally reached my friend, I didn't mention what had happened. The unease lingered, but I couldn't bring myself to speak it aloud. I couldn't explain it, not to anyone, not even to myself. And for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't escape the thought that somewhere, out there, was someone who looked exactly like me, and I had no idea who they were. It was an ordinary day, just like any other. I was on my way to an appointment, one of those routine things I had scheduled weeks ago, and I wasn't in a hurry, just walking slowly through the familiar streets of the city. The air was crisp, the sidewalks bustling with people, and I had that usual feeling of being surrounded by the hum of everyday life. I had to stop by a building on the corner, an old office block, to sign some paperwork. I hadn't been inside in months, but I had visited it often enough to recognize the lobby when I stepped through the door. It was a quiet place, but nothing special, just the kind of place you walk through without much thought. The door opened with a soft creak, and I stepped inside, the familiar smell of polished wood and old furniture greeting me. The lobby was as it had always been, tall, with high ceilings, dimly lit with a few overhead bulbs that seemed to hum in the quiet. There was a small reception desk at the far side, but it was empty. The building felt lifeless, as if no one had been here for days, maybe even longer. The air felt stagnant, heavy. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around. There was no one at the front desk, no sound of footsteps, nothing at all. I thought maybe it was just the time of day, no one around at the moment. But still, there was an odd stillness to the place, the kind that makes you feel like you've stepped into an abandoned world, a place that hasn't been touched in years. I shrugged it off and walked in, heading toward the elevator at the back of the room. But as I walked, something caught my eye. The walls, which had always been a dull beige, now seemed oddly darker, their shadows deeper, more pronounced. It felt like the lights were dimming slightly as I moved through the space, though I couldn't quite figure out why. The elevator door opened with a soft ping, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the floor where my appointment was. But just as the doors closed, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, just a shadow in the corner of the lobby. I blinked and looked back, but nothing was there. No one. The elevator began its slow ascent, the usual mechanical hum accompanying the motion. As I stared at the numbers above the door, counting down the floors, I tried to brush off the feeling that something was wrong. My mind was playing tricks, that's all. When the elevator reached my floor, I stepped out, the doors closing behind me with a soft ding. The hallway ahead was quiet, the carpet worn in places, but nothing unusual. The door to the office was ajar, and I walked toward it, but as I approached, I felt a strange chill running down my spine. The room was darker than I remembered. I opened the door and stepped inside. But the moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed. The room was exactly as it had been the last time I was here, same furniture, same windows, but the air felt off. Heavier, it was as though the whole space had been waiting for me. There was no one else around, but I had the oddest feeling that I wasn't alone. I closed the door behind me, but the click of it seemed too loud in the stillness. The room felt suddenly smaller, like the walls were pressing in on me. I stood in the middle of the space, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping into my chest. Everything was as it should be, but the silence felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of quiet that puts your mind at ease. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. And that's when I noticed them. From the corner of the room, in the shadows, I saw figures. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized they were their people, standing still, perfectly still, watching me. They were lined up along the walls, almost as if they had been waiting for me to arrive. Their faces were obscured in the half-darkness, but their presence was unmistakable. There were at least a dozen of them, men and women, young and old, dressed in clothes that looked strangely out of place, like they didn't belong to this time. They stood in silence, their eyes fixed on me. My heart started to race, my breath quickening. I looked around, desperate for an explanation, but there was no one else, no movement, just those silent figures standing in the shadows, their eyes never leaving me. I wanted to move, to say something, but the air felt thick with an oppressive weight, making it hard to breathe. I reached for the light switch, but it flickered before I could touch it. The lights overhead buzzed once and then dimmed further, casting the room into a deeper darkness. I took a step back, my foot catching on the edge of a chair. The sound echoed in the room, but the figures didn't flinch, didn't move. They were frozen, as though they had been placed there on purpose, as though they were waiting for something waiting for me. My mind was racing, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, my eyes locked onto the figures in the shadows. I wanted to call out to them, to ask who they were, what they wanted, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the room had become a different place, a place that didn't belong in reality, a place where time and space had warped, just for me. The sound of my own breath was deafening in the silence. I backed away slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, but the figures remained unmoving, their eyes still locked on me. I turned to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I yanked it open, stepping into the hallway, but the moment I stepped out of the room, the air changed. The hallway was empty, just as it had been when I first walked in. No one was standing there. The oppressive weight lifted, the tension dissipated, and I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked back toward the office, but the door was still ajar, the room beyond dark and still. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped away, walking quickly down the hallway, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I reached the elevator and pressed the button to go down, but as the doors closed and I descended, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the elevator's mirror. In the glass, I saw them again. The figures. They were standing behind me, still, silent, their eyes watching me with that same unblinking intensity. But when I turned around, the elevator was empty. The room was empty, and I was left wondering if they had ever been there at all. The evening air was thick with the promise of rain, the sky a dull gray that seemed to stretch endlessly above the city. I was on my way home from work, the usual exhaustion weighing heavily on my shoulders, when I reached the crosswalk at the corner of Elm and 3rd Street. It was a busy intersection, one I passed by every day, the lights always changing in their predictable cycle. But that evening, as I stood waiting for the light to change, something felt off. There was a woman standing a few feet away from me, waiting as well. I hadn't noticed her when I first approached, but she was there now, standing still, her back straight and her gaze fixed ahead, unfocused. She was wearing a long, dark coat, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, her face partially obscured by the hood of her coat. She didn't seem out of place, just another person waiting for the light to change, but there was something unnerving about her stillness. It was as though she wasn't just standing there, she was waiting for something, or someone. The light turned red, and I glanced at the street signs. The usual pedestrians were bustling past, the sound of their shoes clicking against the pavement a constant hum, but no one seemed to notice her. The woman didn't move an inch. Her gaze never wavered from the opposite side of the street, her eyes distant and unfocused. I had the strange feeling that she was waiting for someone who wasn't there. The seconds ticked by, and the light turned green, signaling for us to cross. I started walking, my feet moving instinctively, but something tugged at me. I turned back to glance at the woman. She hadn't moved. She was still standing there, motionless, her eyes locked onto the distant horizon. The light had changed, and people were beginning to cross, but she wasn't moving. A strange unease settled in my chest as I paused, unsure of whether I should say something. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting the light to change back, for someone to shout out to her, to bring her attention to the fact that the crosswalk was open. But no one did. Everyone simply walked on, as though she wasn't there at all. I took another step back, my feet feeling heavier with each passing second. The woman hadn't moved, and the crowd around us seemed oblivious. It was as if I were the only one who noticed her. I started to cross the street, my curiosity pulling me back for just a moment, but when I turned my head again to glance at her, I felt a chill run down my spine. She was gone. I stopped dead in my tracks, my mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. She had been standing there, right at the crosswalk, waiting, and now, she was just gone. I scanned the area around me, searching the sidewalk, the street corners, and even across the road, but there was no sign of her. No one had walked past her. No one had crossed the street with her. She had simply vanished, as if the city itself had swallowed her up. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, like something was closing in on me. I stood there, looking back and forth across the street, feeling the world around me shift just a little. My heartbeat quickened as the seconds stretched on, too long, too quiet. I crossed the street quickly, my footsteps now hurried and unsure. I reached the other side and glanced back over my shoulder one last time, but the intersection was the same as it always was: busy. People moving, the sound of traffic filling the space. But there was no sign of her. Not a shadow, not a figure, nothing. Just the ordinary flow of life, unchanged. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That something had shifted. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Had I imagined it? Had I mistaken someone else for her? But no, I had seen her. I had felt her presence there. I had seen her standing at the crosswalk, waiting. And when the light had changed, she had been gone without a trace. I shook my head, trying to push the unsettling thought out of my mind. Maybe it was just the stress, the fatigue of the day, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the thought that I would never forget the feeling that she was waiting for something, or someone, and that, somehow, I had missed it. It had been one of those days that felt like it would never end. The kind where the minutes drag on, each one heavier than the last. I was walking home from work, tired, with the weight of the day still clinging to me. The city was busy, the usual hustle and bustle, but I didn't mind. I preferred walking through the noise, the people, and the motion. It made me feel less alone, even when I was. As I turned the corner from the main street onto my usual route, I noticed the street was quieter than usual. It was later in the evening, but the silence felt different, heavier, as if the street was holding its breath. I shrugged it off and kept walking, eager to get home. The walk was a familiar one I had taken countless times, a route that had become second nature to me. I reached the end of the block and turned left, as I always did. But the moment my foot hit the pavement, I felt something shift. The air grew still, and for a brief moment, the sounds of the city-distant car horns, the chatter of pedestrians seemed to fade. The street ahead of me looked the same, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. I slowed my pace, my eyes scanning the street. The buildings on either side were familiar, but the way they loomed over the sidewalk felt different, almost oppressive. The colors of the streetlights seemed darker, more muted, as though they were struggling to cast their glow. The trees that lined the sidewalk were taller than I remembered, their branches twisting in unnatural directions. The whole street felt as though it had stretched and bent in a way that didn't make sense. I paused, turning to look behind me. The street I had just come from was exactly as it should be, bustling with traffic and people. But ahead, where I was walking, everything seemed still, too still. The buildings that lined the street seemed to have taken on a different shape, their windows reflecting strange, distorted shadows that didn't belong. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. Maybe I was just tired. It had been a long day. I turned my attention back to the street ahead of me, but as I did, I noticed something else. The shops I passed by, the ones I could normally identify in an instant, had changed. The bakery on the corner, the one with the little striped awning, was gone. In its place, there was a small, run-down shop with a dusty window and a sign that read "Antiques" in faded, peeling letters. I blinked, confused. I had walked this route 100 times, and that bakery had always been there. I was certain of it. But now, it was gone, replaced by this odd little store that looked like it belonged in a different time altogether. I glanced around again. The street had changed. The familiar buildings had been replaced by others that didn't belong here. Old, crumbling houses with sagging rooftops, broken windows, and faded paint. There was a sense of abandonment in the air, like the street had been forgotten by time. I took a deep breath and pressed on, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just the lighting, the way the shadows shifted under the streetlights, playing tricks on my eyes. But as I walked further, I noticed more things that didn't make sense. The street I was on was supposed to lead to a park, but instead, it ended in a narrow alley, one I had never seen before. The alley stretched off to my right, dark and narrow, with a rusted old gate at its entrance. I stopped for a moment, unsure of what to do. I didn't remember this alley being here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had walked down this street 100 times without ever seeing it. I stood there, staring at the alley, my mind racing. There was no way I had missed something like this. It was too far out of place. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but the street behind me wasn't the same either. The buildings that had been there just a few moments ago had shifted, their shapes warped, the colors of the lights dimming in a way that felt wrong. The street was no longer the one I knew. I glanced up at the sky, the clouds hanging low, dark, and oppressive. It felt like I was standing in the middle of a dream. Everything around me felt just a little bit off, like I had stepped into a version of my neighborhood that wasn't quite real. I was about to turn around and head back the way I had come, when I noticed something strange. I wasn't alone. At the far end of the street, just past the alley, a figure stood. I couldn't make out who it was, but there was something unsettling about the way they were standing. The figure was motionless, their back to me, staring off into the distance as though they were waiting for something or someone. I felt a chill run through me. I didn't know who they were, but I had an overwhelming urge to turn around and leave. The street had changed too much. It wasn't the place I recognized anymore. It felt as though I had wandered into a different world altogether. But as I began to take a step back, the figure turned. Their head slowly pivoted, and for a moment, I saw their face fell, almost ghostly, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. They weren't looking at me directly, but their gaze felt like it was seeping into me, freezing me in place. Without thinking, I turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, my heart racing. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. The street was still the same, but I could feel something lurking behind me, something that didn't belong. I kept walking, but the sense of unfamiliarity never left. No matter which way I turned, no matter how many steps I took, the street remained different, foreign. The buildings were still out of place, the alleys still waiting at the end of the road, and the figure was still somewhere behind me, even though I couldn't see it anymore. When I finally reached the end of the street, I found myself at a crossroad I didn't recognize. The signs that had once pointed me in the right direction were now blank, like they had been erased from existence. My mind felt scrambled, disoriented. I stood there for a moment, staring at the crossroads. Which way was home? Which way was the street I knew? But no matter how many times I tried to remember, the path I had always walked was gone, replaced by roads that led nowhere. And I knew, deep down, that no matter which way I went now, it wouldn't lead me back to where I belonged. It was a cool, crisp evening, the kind of night that made the air feel fresh and sharp against your skin. I was walking through the city center. The familiar hum of the streets around me, a mixture of people talking, the distant rumble of traffic, and the occasional sound of someone's footsteps on the cobblestone streets. I didn't have anywhere special to go. I was just wandering, trying to clear my head after a long day. The clock tower in the square loomed ahead, its presence as constant and familiar as the buildings that surrounded it. It had been there for as long as I could remember, its tall face always visible from any point in the square. The tower had this quiet authority, this feeling that nothing could ever change its hands always moving in a steady, rhythmic dance with time. As I approached the square, the sun dipped lower, casting a soft glow over the cobblestones. The clock tower's bells began to chime, echoing across the square. It was the hour 6 o'clock. The sound was deep and resonant, the kind that made the air feel thick, as though the world itself paused to listen. But something strange happened as the chimes reverberated through the air. The last chime didn't fade as it should have. Instead, it hung there, suspended in the air, like it was stuck. The street, which had been moving with the usual rhythm of life, seemed to slow. I stopped, looking around in confusion. For a brief moment, everything felt wrong. People on the sidewalk had frozen mid-step, their faces blank as they stood still in place. A child, clutching an ice cream cone, was caught in mid-laugh, her expression suspended in time. The dog on the leash didn't move, its tail frozen in mid. I took a step forward, my heart thumping louder in my chest. Asterisk, what is happening? I wondered, the sense of strangeness creeping through me. My gaze flicked to the clock tower, its hands still pointing at 6, the chimes still echoing through the square. But there was no ticking, no movement from the clock. It had stopped. I looked down at my own hands, flexing my fingers. They moved normally, but everything around me was still. The city had frozen in place, locked in time, and I was the only one who seemed to be moving. I walked slowly toward the center of the square, a strange sense of urgency mixed with curiosity gnawing at me.
I felt
out of place. The normal, comforting bustle of the city was gone. The world had gone quiet, but I could still hear the ringing of the clock's chimes in my ears, almost as if they were following me. I stopped at the base of the clock tower, staring up at its face. The hands were stuck, but the clock itself was intact. Nothing seemed physically wrong with it. The bell that had chimed earlier remained suspended in the air, as though it was caught in a never-ending echo. A shiver ran down my spine. I felt like I was standing at the center of something much bigger than me, something that had happened outside of my control. I looked around again, but everything remained frozen. The world was suspended in this strange moment, and I couldn't understand why. Then, something caught my eye. From the corner of the square, where the street lamps cast long shadows, I saw a figure, a man. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, frozen in place, just like everyone else. But there was something different about him. His eyes were moving. Not a lot, but enough to make me notice. They flicked from side to side, as though he was aware of the stillness around him, aware of me. I stood still, watching him. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt like he could see me, as though we were the only two people still moving in a world that had stopped. His lips parted, and although I couldn't hear anything, I knew he was speaking. He mouthed something at me, something that felt important, urgent. I couldn't read his lips clearly, but I understood. He was trying to say something, trying to communicate. I took a step toward him, my heart racing in my chest, but the closer I got, the more the world seemed to distort around me. The buildings, the frozen people, the streetlights, they began to blur at the edges. It was as if the reality I was standing in was becoming unstable, like I was on the edge of a dream. I reached out to touch the figure, but as soon as my hand came close to him, he disappeared. The space where he had stood remained, but he was gone, like a memory that had faded just out of reach. The moment he vanished, everything snapped back into place. The clock tower's bells resumed their rhythm. The hands of the clock started moving again, and the world exploded back into motion. People resumed walking, cars started driving, and the street was filled with life again. The child's laughter returned, the dog started wagging its tail, and the usual noise of the city flooded back into my ears. But it didn't feel the same. The chimes from the clock tower still echoed in my mind, and the figure, the man who had looked at me, who had spoken, lingered in my thoughts. I couldn't explain it, couldn't understand what had just happened. I continued walking down the street, but the world around me felt different. I felt different. The clock tower, once a steady, comforting presence, now felt like something other, something that wasn't just a part of the city, but a silent observer of it, controlling it in ways I couldn't comprehend. And in that strange silence, as I made my way home, I couldn't help but wonder if the moment had truly passed, or if I was still standing there, at the center of the square, locked in a time that had never quite moved on.